There we go. We're live.
Great.
Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. Joining me today is Amy Springer Robinson. Hello.
Hi.
Amy is another one of the therapists that works at Effective Artistry with us. I'm excited to have you here today.
I'm excited to be here.
This has turned into like an impromptu little series. Everybody met Kat last week, and now you this week. This is the This Is Not Therapy Hour. Amy and I are both licensed therapists, but this is not therapy for very, very, very many reasons. One of which is that it is public and on the internet. What it is just an open conversation. Amy and I are here chatting with one another and with all of you. It's like any other conversation for Amy and I, minus that we're trying to take into consideration who all you are and what you might be interested in hearing about and in our phrasing. If you are willing and able to participate in the chat, we love that, putting comments in because it gives us more information about who you are and what you might be interested in. And the more information we have, the more we can feel as though we are accurately determining those things rather than just doing our best guesswork. We both work with a therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, and family counseling with individuals who are in the state of Illinois. We also work with a couple of executive functioning who can see people anywhere in the world with an internet connection. I think that's about it.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm glad to have you here.
I'm happy to be here. It's very impromptu, but I'm excited. Nervous, but excited.
That's kind of how I roll generally. I was going to say we roll, but not everyone's impromptu around here, but I'm pretty
You're very
fly by the
impromptu.
seat of your pants.
Yeah.
Partly because I think doing it that way, I might have mentioned this last week, I think doing it that way is beneficial to people. Like, I guess there's a certain level of confidence that people will see me as having interesting and valuable things to say or being an expert or whatever.
Mhm.
And so when I think about being like making a mistake or appearing sloppy or unprepared or whatever, I think of that getting interpreted by people as like, oh, even experts do this, when
Mhm.
making them feel better about it when they do it, as opposed to people reading it and being like, oh, this person's not worth listening to.
Yeah.
It's just everything people are exposed to is like polished, it's edited and after the fact, and people have so much of an opportunity to make sure they come off a certain way that I think it gives people the impression that like, oh, other people are just polished all the time because they don't see all the what's on the cutting room floor.
That's super interesting. I actually just got out of a session that was a little about like feeling like you're imperfect and everything is polished around you and the impacts that has on you. And I think I was also feeling like, well, I'm not dressed for the stream. I don't have anything to talk about on the stream. What if I come across as like not perfect or not polished? And then now you're talking and I'm like, oh, but don't I pride myself on being as authentic as possible? And isn't this authentic? And this is how I showed up today. And
Sure.
I'm not always polished and that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're in all our supervisions where, so Amy is also our clinical director.
Oh, too.
I forgot to mention that. Amy and I are the supervisors here. So anyway, in our group supervisions, you see me talking all the time to people about like your clients think well of you.
Mm-hmm.
So when you acknowledge something that you think of as embarrassing or a mistake or whatever, and you're worried that it will make them think you're lame, no, it makes them think that that thing is something that cool people do.
Mm.
And generally, I kind of think this is a universal thing, but I think generally people have this underlying thought that like, I'm the only one making the mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have this insecurity of if I reveal to anybody that I don't know something, or if anybody sees me slip up or whatever, then they'll evaluate me as being less in some way.
For sure.
Where a lot of the time it liberates other people to be like, oh, okay, good. Because I also experienced that. Like one of the things that I prompt therapists to do early on in our training is like, if you're feeling anxious, you tell the client you're feeling anxious.
Yep.
If you feel like I don't know what to say or I'm worried that I'm not helpful enough, then you say that because it sets the table for them to be able to say similar kinds of things.
For sure. I wonder what the difference is. I'm thinking right now, like what is the difference between being able to do that in a session with a client? Because I have no issues doing that even in a consult or a first session, just saying like exactly what I'm thinking versus, oh, this is now on the internet for worldwide consumption at any given point. I can't mess this up.
Yeah. Well, I've thought about that too. I think there's a couple, well, at least I have a couple different ways of talking about it that I think are interesting. Not
I'd
as
love
in
to hear
like,
that.
these are the two things that are there. It's just two things I've identified. One is that it's art in a sense. To me, my definition of art is communication that is intended for an unknown future audience.
Mm.
So, like anything that a person is doing just purely for their own sense of, like it's never intended to be shared with somebody else, I wouldn't generally call that art. Which doesn't mean I don't think it's good or anything like that, but there's a difference between journaling and writing essays or whatever, right? And so all communication to me is one human's attempt to impact the thoughts, the feelings, or the behaviors of one or more other humans.
Okay.
Like whenever it's an intentional attempt, everything we do impacts it, but whenever we're intentionally trying to impact it. And so art then is when I'm doing that with an unknown recipient. I'm creating something with the intention of impacting one or more people that I have not identified who those people are. They're not present right now. It could be anybody.
Right.
So part of it is that it's all these people not only that theoretically could be watching it right now, but that could theoretically watch it later as it's saved on YouTube or whatever, and we don't know who they are, and we can't figure out if they interpret us in a certain way. If I say something intending to get across this message, but the way I phrase it understandably gets interpreted in this other way by somebody, I can't find that out and correct it. So there's some nerves there.
Sure.
And then the other thing I think is, this is such a charged conversation.
Here we go. You said this would be easy.
Oh, did I?
No, that's just how I interpreted what you said. You said, no big deal. It's just you and me talking, except there's other people watching.
Yeah, no big deal.
Yeah, that's easy. But now charged. That's not.
Well, because there's a phrase that people use that's such a charge, like a lightning rod phrase of cancel culture.
Yeah.
But there's some dynamics behind that I think are actually quite important to explore. Not about like the reality necessarily of what happens or what people do, but on the impact that it has had on so many people, including me and you and everybody, of like this fear of what if I do something wrong?
Yep. What if I say something wrong? I think that's a big reason I've avoided doing the stream for a year now. Like, what if I say something wrong? That's on the internet forever. Like, what if my clients cancel me? What if potential clients cancel me? What if the work I want to do in the industry in the future, like, brings this up, and now I have like this personal attack on me at some point?
Yeah.
Like, it's really scary.
Yeah. It's a very vulnerable position to be in, to put yourself where you're on camera. Oh, we have a comment. I'll read that in a second. Where you're on camera and other people are not, and they can see you, but you don't know them, and it's there forever, and people can interpret it in all kinds of ways. And I want to make it clear that I'm not, part of the reason that I'm hesitant with such a charged phrase is because there are so many people who are anti-cancel culture. Like, people go overboard and blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And that's not the point I'm trying to make. It's not about what people should or shouldn't do. I find those complaints to be very ironic, because what they're effectively saying is I should be allowed to say what I want to say, and you shouldn't be allowed to say what you want to say about it, which is nonsense to me. But I'm talking about what it gives rise to in people, this sense of like an awareness of, oh, I've seen it happen enough. There's definitely ways that without knowing it, you can do something that causes somebody else some distress or whatever, even if that's not your intention, and then find out about it later. And it becomes easier for people to just be like, well, I won't do anything in that way. I won't accidentally hurt anybody.
100%.
Hello, Brandon. I'm a friend of your dad's. He recommended I watch your stream. I've watched a few weeks. I've been enjoying it and find it useful. He mentioned that you do Friday co-work sessions, and I should ask about that. Thank you. Yeah, great. So we do. It's actually Marie and Sarah, our executive functioning coaches, have been running some co-working sessions, which is kind of like if you're familiar with body doubling, it's kind of like group body doubling, where Marie and Sarah are on camera and they do a little bit at the beginning to kind of set the structure and the tone and the message of that session, and then spend 90 minutes themselves doing work, and for the people who are attending to do work, and they time things and say, let's take a break now, and etc. I will check, because it's not every. I think it was on Thursdays, and I think it's taking a break right now, but I'm not actually sure.
Me neither. I just got back from vacation. I don't know.
Yeah, I was out of the office working remotely last week too. Marie just moved, and I think they're on hiatus. But I will find out from Sarah and Marie, and I will. How will I post this information? Well, we'll put it on our social media.
Yep.
So if you follow us on Twitter or I don't know the proper terminology for Facebook, I think you're a fan of the page or something.
If you like the page.
Like the page. So I'll put it out. I'll have it put out by the social media, and otherwise I'll make sure to find out and announce it on the stream next week. One thing you can do though, especially because I see it tells us which platform you're coming through when you send a comment, so I can see that you're on Twitch. I believe, I could be wrong about this. I know for sure on YouTube the streams are saved. I think it's true on Twitch also that you can access and watch old ones. So even in lieu of like a live one, you can go to the YouTube channel, Effective Artistry YouTube channel, and watch one of the old ones where it'll still be structured. Because it's the way it's structured, it's not that Sarah and Marie are necessarily interacting a lot with the attendees. So watching it after the fact will be very similar to watching it live. It won't be exactly the same, and it might be less effective.
And I do know it's on YouTube because I happened to accidentally queue up one of our co-working videos. It was like the next thing that came up in my YouTube playlist. So
Really?
I know that they're there.
That's cool. So yeah, I would go check that out as a way to have something until we have another live one happening. The reason that body doubling works, well, this is theory, right? Like it's not a mechanism that is known for, but to me, the reason that body doubling works has a lot to do with your beliefs and perceptions about the other people who are involved. And so knowing that they're not actually there and that it's a recording might actually diminish how effective it is for a person.
That's
knowing
possible.
that you can pause it and come back to it. And,
You're not
but it's
held
worth trying.
as accountable live. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
They're on a live stream like right now. Even though we're just depictions on your computer or whatever, we represent you. Think of us as real people. And so we're impacting you in the ways that you are impacted by real people. Where when you're watching a pre-recorded video, that shifts and
sure.
you're impacted in different ways. It feels less, well, like for example, right now, whether you're commenting or not, you're aware that you could theoretically comment and that we could see it and respond to you. And that changes how you're engaging, both you who put the comment there, but also anybody who's watching it now putting comments. There's that thought that present of I could comment. But thank you for asking about that. Yes, and I will make sure that we announce that as soon as I am able to prompt Sarah and Marie and find out what exactly the plan is. Yeah. Our first comment with you on the stream.
our first comment, and it's about co-working, which I love. I
Yeah,
think I need to
co-working is
hop
cool.
into that next live one, honestly.
Actually, that's a good thought. I might join.
I think
They're super helpful.
They are.
So body doubling, I've referenced that a few times without defining what that is. Body doubling is a term for, well, it means different things in different contexts. In this context, it means when you are sitting down with someone else, one or more other people who are doing similar kinds of things to what you are wanting yourself to do, and that it then becomes easier for you to be able to do those things because you're in the presence of other people who are doing similar things. So that's the idea. It's a lot easier for us, even if we're not talking, right? If there are 5 of us who are all writers, even if we're not interacting with one another, if we're all sitting at the same table while we write, it's a lot easier for me to write because there's 4 others writing here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of theory behind that, but to me, it's about how we respond to social cues.
As opposed to how other people in social settings might perceive us.
Well, I think it's kind of hard to separate those things out, but I think you're welcome. It's great. Thanks. I'm used to reading it out because Caitlin can't always read it.
I can't see it from here either.
Yeah.
It's pretty small, so I appreciate that.
I think people generally underestimate how integral other people are to just the experience of being who we are.
I would have to agree, and I totally agree with that statement.
They're like, when people say things like, I want to figure out what I want for myself, as opposed like, I know what I want, but that's all shaped by like what other people want from me and whatever. I want to figure out what I want for myself, as though there is something that you could want for yourself that isn't impacted by
Everything
what you
around
think
you.
other people would like, right?
Yeah.
Like take anything that you might theoretically, X, and you would theoretically love to do X, but you're aware that if you do X, it will harm a person you love. Now you don't want to do it anymore, right? Like
Yep.
that's not a thing you can separate out.
Mhm.
Not to mention that the way that you perceive and think of everything is shaped by the language people use and et cetera, et cetera.
The perceptions of others, like how you perceive something is based on how others perceive it, or others perceive you perceiving it. Like it's
Yeah,
all connected.
in philosophy, they'll refer to the like observable world as the shared reality. Like the distinguishing characteristic of what we all generally think of as like the real world is the fact that other people can confirm that it exists in the way that you're observing it. That's what makes it empirical. So really, like fundamentally, there is no such thing as reality without getting feedback from other people about what they also are seeing and perceiving.
What is it then called? So what is it then called if I'm like, hey, that tree is green, and you're like, no, that tree is yellow? Is it still a shared reality even if we don't agree on, like, we both agree there's a tree there, but we don't agree on like the perception of it? Is that still shared reality, or is there another term?
No, shared reality it's referring to the this is real like metaphysical philosophy stuff, which I love and find to be useful, but it's referring to like we're labeling something, a concept of something, not discussing which specific things exist in the shared reality or don't, just that theoretically there's the internal subjective reality,
which no one but the self
right. Mine is mine, yours is yours. Right. Theoretically, there is no way for you to experience mine or vice versa.
And then everything in the external.
And then there's the external reality, and it's internal, external is actually not the best way to break it down because of the fact that things like internal to my body do exist in the shared reality, right? Like things in my stomach can be observed by others with the proper tools.
But our experience of our internal isn't part of the shared reality.
Right. Our conscious mind, like our thoughts and feelings, are not part of the shared reality.
Okay.
But that's why talking about it as the internal subjective reality and the shared reality as opposed to internal versus external, because internal, external can mean other things.
Makes sense.
So it's not about whether we agree on the specifics of what exists in the shared reality. We're just saying that is what makes something real as opposed to it. Like if I right now were to hallucinate and see a lamp on that table in the corner that isn't actually there.
No.
The way that I would know it's not actually there is that you can't also see it. If you also see it, then we don't call it a hallucination.
Unless we're both hallucinating.
Well, that's where things get real tricky, and we talk about things like mass hallucination and whatever. But by definition, what we mean by hallucination is I'm perceiving something and understand it to be that it exists in the physical environment, but other people don't experience or perceive the same thing.
Right.
If we all perceive the same thing,
then it's no longer hallucination.
Right, then it's just real. That's what the point of shared reality is. How can we define reality outside of the idea that you and I and everybody all experience it?
Yeah.
Whether we call it yellow or green, or in a more broad way, whether we call it green or verde or whatever, right? Like the specific language doesn't necessarily matter, just the idea that there are things that we all
Makes sense.
Agree upon. And then we get into like fact versus opinion stuff, where like beautiful, for example, is a descriptor of something that exists in the shared reality, but it's a description of my perception of it, the impact it has on me.
Right.
And whatever.
So that's an opinion, right?
Right.
That's the opinion. Wouldn't even being like green versus yellow be opinion of shared reality? Like my opinion is it's this color, your opinion is it's that color?
You could make that argument that it's opinion.
Or is it a language thing, Brandon?
Or you could make the argument that it's a language thing. One of the one of the fun things, I don't know. This is a philosophical question, an old one that I feel like is very common even among people who don't like care much or think about it as philosophy of how do I know that what I see as blue is what you see as blue?
You don't.
Right. But it's a question people explore a lot of like, what if what I see as blue is what you see as red, but what you see as red, I see as blue? Like, how would we ever know? These questions sometimes, same with like paradoxes, to me, they're just pointing out to us some of the limitations of things like our perception and our language. The fact that we cannot communicate about color in a way that definitively shows
Yeah.
that what we're experiencing has the technical term qualia, that our experience of it is the same experience in a way that is the same. We can't even define it, right? So a lot of these things are not questions that have answers, but more are just like a way to prompt somebody to see the edges of their abilities. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
I think that's like what Zen koans are and logical paradoxes and things like that.
Zen koan, new term for me. Logical paradox, not so much, but
Zen koans are questions, or people will sometimes call them riddles, that are unanswerable.
okay.
The famous one that everyone will reference is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And everybody loves to reference that one because then they just be like, it's like this, or,
Mm-hmm.
being cheeky about it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's effectively the equivalent of like when someone's like, if there's an all-powerful God, can that entity create a rock which is so heavy that it itself can't lift it? Trying to point out, like, if it's all-powerful, it either can create a rock like that or it can't. But if it can, then it can't lift.
Then are you really all powerful?
Right. What this is pointing out is the limitations in our human ability to use language to conceptualize and discuss things.
Yeah.
Which is super useful, but very frustrating, especially for modern people who are, by and large, I think in our culture, people have this idea that human understanding is accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Like that fundamentally humans not only are capable of, but in many ways do actually understand the truth of the universe.
Right.
As opposed to like, no, we're all doing our best to filter it through our limited abilities to perceive and
Which are
understand
quite
things.
limited.
Very. I mean, compared to literally any other version of it, just mind-numbingly limitless, basically. But in the grand scheme of things, yeah. Super common thing for people these days is we'll take something that we observe, like we observe a pattern of something, and we label it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is useful to label patterns. See, like, oh, I see this connection happening a lot, so let me label that connection.
Mm-hmm.
And then people take the label that we created to describe that pattern of connections, and then say that the reason that that pattern occurs is because of the label that we assigned it.
Mm. It's real backwards.
Yes, but it's super, super, super common.
Super common. I mean, I do it.
Oh, y'all do.
You've called me out on it many a times when I'm like, but it's this thing happening. And you're like, but is that just your label of it? Is that just your perception of it? Is it just like, why is it that thing happening? Zoom back out. Like, you're
Right.
so zoomed into this pattern that you've identified. Zoom back out.
A label that we apply to something cannot be the reason that the thing is the way that it is, because we can only apply the label after observing it be the way that it is.
Mm-hmm.
So the label cannot be the reason that it is that way.
Which makes sense, but then why are we so keen on having labels put on patterns?
Well, it's super useful inherently to have labels. So let's make a specific example that's super common. We'll call it laziness.
Ew.
Yeah.
That's a dirty word.
Where what we notice, there's an experience that can become a pattern, right? There's a thing that I'm supposed to do, or I'm meaning to do, or I think is important or want to do, and I don't do it. Or I intend to do it at a certain time and I don't do it at that time, or whatever, right?
It must be lazy.
So why does that happen? Who knows, right? Like, depends on a lot of variables. We're talking about a theoretical vague thing in a vague context, but there are context specific things. But there's theoretically some reason it doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But if that same experience happens again, meaning the experience can't be the same, but it can be the same in the way that we define as there's something I'm supposed to do and I don't do it. That is a label that we can, a descriptor we can use for many, many different situations.
Yep.
So then we identify that that's a pattern by saying, well, that element of all these, even though each thing is a different thing, that element of it can be described in the same way. So now I'm connecting all these things.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's really useful, as you can see right now, to label that in some shorthand way, because otherwise it's really weird and difficult and unwieldy to talk about it
Mm-hmm.
or notice it or think about it. So we want to label it. And we come up with the term lazy. Like, I was supposed to do a thing and I didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
If that is the case, then we can always say accurately, I was lazy. because that's what the word means.
But is it accurate?
Well, yes, because that's what it means by definition.
Okay.
Where it isn't accurate is then when people turn that around and say, I didn't do it because I'm lazy.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like saying, I am tall. Even though we could say, like, compared to giraffes, I'm not tall, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a generally accepted and understood piece of language that when we're talking about a person being tall, we mean as compared to other humans. So it's an accurate and useful thing to say, Brandon is tall.
Mm-hmm.
I also measure about from my feet to the tip of my head is about 6'5".
But you're not 6'5" because you're tall.
Right.
Got it.
That's true. Then we label me as tall.
Mm-hmm.
And then if anyone's like, well, how did Brandon get to be 6'5"? Well, because he's tall. That's the equivalent of people saying, like, why is this person struggling and not doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing? Because they're lazy.
Yeah.
That's a label that applies after we observe what happened.
Yep.
The same is true for disorders. And that one is much more controversial to say.
Oh. Is that where we're headed?
Doesn't have to be, but like autism, for example,
Yep.
What happens is we notice, this thing that seems difficult or like causes a person to have some problems or
Mhm.
struggles. We see it not only with this person, but with this person and this person, a bunch of people.
Yep.
And again, each thing is different, but we're defining the element of it that can be the same. So, for example, we could call that an experience of an intense emotional experience that causes meltdown behavior, right? Each specific thing is actually different, but
Mhm.
we can use that language to apply to a bunch of different people in a bunch of different cases.
Yep.
So we notice that, and then we start to notice this other thing of like, wait a second, this person that has that struggle, they also struggle with this other thing. And I noticed that all these other people I identified that had that first struggle, not all of them struggle with the second thing, but a lot of them do
Mm-hmm.
at a much higher rate than people who don't share the first struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like these two things correlate, and then a third, and a fourth, and we're just tacking things on. And at a certain point, it becomes much more useful to say, we're going to label this cluster of observed experiences, patterns of behavior. We're going to label this cluster as, we'll call it autism
Mm-hmm.
in this case, but all disorders, characteristics, personality traits, it's that.
I'm thinking about how autism used to be identified and there used to be a separate diagnosis of Asperger's, and like how that, I'm guessing, came from, well, this particular subset of people didn't fit this other criteria over here. So we have to come up with a label for this subset that doesn't match it. And yet we still want to call it autism because it has XYZ like it's still some of these things, but not all of these things.
So that does happen, but the example you use is not an example of that.
So tell me more.
So what you're talking about is true of like bipolar type 1, type 2, for
Mhm.
example, where we observe a series of behaviors or patterns or whatever, and then as we study it more closely, we start to notice even like some distinct subcategories where it's like, okay, all these people meet this criteria or can be defined, their experiences can be defined in this way, but we could also say like there's a group whose experiences we can define this way, and a separate group in that large group, a separate subgroup that can be defined slightly differently. So then we
It's
get
like a Venn diagram, kind of like with some over.
it
No.
can be, but that's not what I'm describing right now.
For sure.
This is what's the word I'm looking for? What's the term for like binomial nomenclature? Where it's like species, kingdom, species, phylum.
I don't know, but all I can think of is hierarchical right now, and that's not what you're trying to say.
No, there's a particular word that I'm blanking on right
My
now.
19-year-old over here, he'd be like, I know the word.
Where it's like, in the group of polygons,
Yeah.
some are triangles, some are rectangles. Nothing that's a triangle is also a rectangle, and nothing that's a rectangle is also a triangle, but both groups count as polygons. Whatever.
I can Google it.
I don't remember. Maybe it'll come to me later. So that's this is gonna get confused with other language we use a lot, but that's divergent, meaning we're taking one thing and splitting it up into multiple subcategories.
Mhm.
So categories are diverging from one another.
Yep.
Another thing that happens is convergent, where two different things are identified independently of one another, And then later on, we're like, hey, we think this might be the same thing.
So that's what happened with like just the disorder diagnostic criteria and like
Yeah, but
bringing
also
it
the
to
history
in.
of it, actually.
Can you tell me more? Because my understanding was that like Asperger's was always understood as something akin to autism, and then like
So this goes back to the 1940s and depending on what language you want to use, the discovery, the invention, the identification of autism.
okay,
So before the 1940s, there was no thing called autism. Theoretically, there were always people who would have matched the criteria that we now utilize to identify someone as
Absolutely.
autistic, but that's not how it was conceptualized. I am not a 100% history buff on this. I know more than almost anyone, but not all of it. So what is known, what I am very confident about, is that two different men in two different places both started studying and labeling what we will now call autism separately from one another.
Okay.
What I am given to understand, but I don't know enough to say authoritatively, is that actually there was a woman before either of those two
Well, that would track.
that started to identify and study this, and that each of those two men kind of cribbed off of her work in different ways.
Okay.
I don't know the details on that, but it does match like my bias of what I would expect something like that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, clearly mine as well.
But one of those men, his name was Hans Asperger.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Nazi German scientist. And so Asperger's syndrome was the thing that he was discovering and labeling.
Okay.
The other person whose name I don't remember, and I think was English, maybe American, I'm not sure. But that's the one who, as he was studying it, came to label it autism. So Asperger's and autism were syndromes, diagnoses that were developed separately
of one another.
And then later people started to say, like, I think this is basically the same thing, just with some different presentations.
That makes sense.
And what Asperger's is known for is that Hans Asperger, he was studying they were young boys, white boys, and he would refer to them as his little professors.
Mm-hmm.
So he was talking about this archetype of young, mild-mannered boys who were precocious and intellectual, like very intellectually focused, in particular to get special interests in particular fields, but mild-mannered, not rambunctious or loud, and fairly responsive to direction, and like overly polite and constrained. And you call them as little professors because it was like if you take the stereotype of like a 40-year-old somewhat neurotic professor and put it in the body of an 8-year-old, that kind of incongruity. And that's what Asperger's ended up getting used as to label people as. There's a lot of correlation between what many people would call high functioning autism or low support needs autism and Asperger's. There's something referred to as Aspie supremacy, which is where people who are identified as or were diagnosed as having Asperger's will think of themselves as being superior to other autistic people, like it's the good kind of autism. Yeah, lots of fun stuff there.
All that. Super.
But it's just so much of what people understand about, we're talking about autism, but this is true of all disorders. So much of what people understand about autism, they ascribe to autism. Meaning, if we say, as an example, here's something that many people know, that autistic people stim. What we call stims in the literature, what is generally referred to as restrictive and repetitive, particularly physical behavior. So the stereotype would be like the hand flapping, or the happy jumping, or the rocking.
Right?
And it's known and generally accepted that stimming is a self-regulatory behavior, that it helps a person, when they're stimming, it helps them to regulate their emotions. Now, if you ask people why does stimming help someone regulate their emotions?
Because they're autistic.
They'll say because they're autistic. How do we know they're autistic? In part, among other things, because we observe them stim as a self-regulatory technique. So that's not really an answer to the question. To just say autistic people stim to regulate their emotions. Why does that regulate their emotions? Because they're autistic. That's that's circular.
It's a, I was going to say closed loop. Thank you. Circular.
Yeah.
It's a much shorter way of saying it. More efficient, if you will.
So yeah, that's not as applicable to everyone's life. But when we start to think of these things, another really two very common and very problematic ones are depressed and anxious,
Mm-hmm. Oof.
where someone will be experiencing what we label as depression, and then they're given to understand, people tell them that the reason they're experiencing it is because they're depressed.
Yeah.
But that cannot be. You cannot be experiencing something that we label as X because
Of
you
X.
are X.
Yeah.
We didn't label it until you were experiencing it. It's a lot of what leads to the misunderstanding that all of this is biological, solely biological in origin, which is not the case.
I'm thinking about it as like, why does someone sleep all day? Oh, well, because they're depressed. But and thinking about sleep specifically and like the disorders of like, what is it, 70% that we've looked up? 70% of disorders include
Some sudden shift in sleep patterns is a diagnostic criteria for like 60% of the disorders.
wild. But
Yeah.
thinking about like, why does someone sleep all day? Well, because they're depressed, as opposed to maybe because they're tired. Maybe there's too much on their plate. Maybe they're just really exhausted by things. Maybe they have not been getting enough sleep. Maybe there is maybe they have sleep apnea. Maybe there is some type of,
Or anemic, or maybe there is a medical issue, biological issue. Like disorders, no matter what you think of them, if you say that they're medical, you're just wrong. That's just an inaccurate.
right.
Like you can make the argument that they are biological in origin, or even solely biological in origin. That still doesn't mean they're medical. They do not fall under the field of medicine. That's why they're disorders and not diseases. Doesn't mean that medical interventions aren't helpful. They obviously are.
Mhm.
We have tons and tons of observed evidence that medical interventions can be, not always are, but can be helpful with a lot of these things.
Yeah.
But they're not medicine. And yeah, we talk about cognitive miser, right? The brain doesn't spend resources without a reason. So if you're exploring a question, this is a problem, how do I solve it? As soon as you arrive at the answer of, oh, this is how I solve it, you stop exploring the question. And now your question becomes, okay, how do I implement that solution? And a lot happens when you take somebody's answer to that question and take it away from them. Is very uncomfortable because now I got to go back to like trying to figure out what the hell's going on here.
You mean like taking away, you are sleeping all day because you're depressed. What if that wasn't the answer? Now we have to actually look at other reasons.
Right now their brain is going to say, okay, well, it's time for us to go back to the drawing board and try and come up with an answer of why am I sleeping all day, which is a difficult and draining activity. Same with, well, if I'm not just putting all this stuff off because I'm a lazy person, then I have to look at figuring out some other reason, and it takes resources. And we like to believe that we have the answers, even when the answers we have don't actually result in us being able to solve the problem. People will very, very frequently, this is an additive thinking thing, they'll say, well, the answer I have is accurate and correct, even if it doesn't result in me being able to solve the problem. If that's the case, it means there must be some other additional information or answer that I don't have yet, and I have to go find that. But it's not that what I already understand might be inaccurate. So doing it X kind of a way is how it's done. If that doesn't work for me, is because I'm weird and different in some way that makes that not work. It still should work, but I'm broken in some way, deficient in some way. So now I need to find an additional thing. And I'm not even getting rid of that. I still need to do that. That still works. But I also need extra other strategies for people who have ADHD or whatever.
That's exactly what I'm thinking about. Like thinking about ADHD and how like there's all these hacks and tools and things that get promoted. And then when it doesn't work for someone, then being like, well, my ADHD is just that bad. Or, yeah, I can do that, but I must need something else too to support me in that because, just using a planner isn't helping or just using a to-do list doesn't work for me. Yeah, I can write it down all day long, but then I just look at it and go, I'm a failure because I didn't do anything on it.
Right.
There must be something additional wrong with me.
And a lot of that is based on a misunderstanding of what other people's experiences are.
Mm-hmm.
That like, if I'm given to believe, and again, people talk about it like this, right? Like, oh, just write it down, you'll get it done. And anybody who says that knows that they don't get everything done that they write down, because nobody does. But people don't often think, oh, it is important to say that writing it down will help you get it done. It doesn't always work, but it makes it more likely, right?
Sure.
So we don't say that. We just say write it down. And we believe that it's just understood that, like, of course this doesn't work all the time.
We're also not taking into account that someone who might be saying, write it down, you'll get it done, might be writing 3 things down when someone else might write 10 things down.
Right.
None of that is taken into consideration either.
Yep. So that's the thing about human understanding, right? Like, I was having a conversation with someone the other day that was saying, they were talking about resilience, the concept of resilience. And as an example, they were like, well, there must be a reason that, for example, 2 trees that are growing in the same place and one of them survives and one of them doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And my response was, that's impossible. No 2 trees can grow in the
Exist in the
same
same
place. They can grow in the same place by the way we define it. We can say they're both growing in this desert, or they're both growing in the state of Illinois, or they're both growing within 5 feet of one another. But they don't have roots in the same spots and leaves in the same spots.
Right.
So we think of these things as being the same because it is useful. They are similar. They are the same in some elements,
Mm-hmm.
but they're never actually the same. And we forget that part. We call them same as a shorthand. It's useful to recognize that some elements are the same.
Yeah.
But then we get confused and think that they are literally exactly the same. And so we drop out all this extra information that would be super helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Why can all the other kids in my class do this thing and I can't? We all have the same teacher. We all have the same assignments.
Sure.
But you don't. You don't have the same exact experience of that teacher and those assignments. And also,
You have the same teacher, but how you receive the language is different. I think that's the part that gets.
yeah, that gets back to the shared reality versus subjective internal reality. Because we could say that we have the same teacher, and by the sense of, like, the person who is teaching us is the same individual,
Mm-hmm.
that is true. But if what we're saying is we have the same experience of that teacher, I'm hearing all the same things you're hearing, I'm learning the same things you're learning, I'm seeing the same, that is not true.
Nope.
We hear different parts of what that teacher is saying. And I'm not even talking about the fact that I might be absent from a class that you are in and you're absent from a class. I'm saying even if we're both side by side paying attention
Mm-hmm.
to the same person the whole time, we still get different things. We get different understandings and different messages that come across. Literally, some of this is just language based, right? Like, if the
Mm-hmm.
professor uses a word that you have a clear meaning attached to and I don't, you get something out of that I don't. Or you have a clear meaning attached to it and I have a different clear meaning attached to it. And now we're getting different things out of it.
Right.
It is a huge problem.
It is a huge problem. That's why language is so important.
One of the many reasons. Really fundamentally, I'm just trying to always help people understand, without saying it like this brazenly, because
Mhm.
it's a big leap, that you are language. Like, the thing you consider you, the me, the thinking, like the part that notices stuff and is conscious, is composed of language.
It's a pretty brazen statement, but I actually appreciate you saying it just that way, because I sit here and think, like, no, I really am, because I can't describe me or think of me or experience the world around me or how other people experience me or think of me or react to me. I can't do anything. I can't exist without the use of language. I am
Well, consciously, yes.
yes. Like, how would I even begin to do that without using language to?
You go ahead, think a thought.
I'm trying. Like, that's the thing. I'm over here and I'm like I might need to cancel my next session and sit with this for a second. This is huge.
I'm using language here too to mean not language as in, like, the English language, which
all language.
is a shared set of symbols. I'm using language to mean symbolic representation.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily just words, but we connect some abstract symbol.
Mm-hmm.
We connect that to something that it theoretically is meant to represent for us, what it means. So it's not just words, it's images and feelings and sounds and all kinds of things, but it's these symbols. It's the only way you can perceive anything, theoretically. Other people would disagree, but neither thing can be proven definitively. I believe they would. I believe in what's called soft linguistic determinism. as opposed to.
Soft. I'm gonna look that up later.
It's basically what we're talking about. That the idea that you can't even perceive a thing until you simultaneously construct a symbol representing the thing.
Okay.
And it's real like technical and like because I can perceive that tree, but I'm perceiving it as a tree
Because of its shape, size.
because it matches whatever I have what's called a perceptual set of tree that has certain qualifying characteristics, and what I'm observing matches enough of those characteristics. That's how I identify it.
Mm-hmm.
But that tree is also some kind of a tree. I don't know. I'm going to say oak.
I have no idea.
It's some kind of thing. I am not perceiving an oak. I am not capable of perceiving it as an oak until I establish the symbol of the word oak having connection to some perceptual set, some list of criteria that defines what an oak is.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I have that, I no longer am seeing a tree. Now I'm seeing an oak. The more like the example that everybody has all the time is people. Like before you know somebody, that's just a person.
That's a person.
Maybe a man or a woman or a black person or whatever characteristics you identify of a person.
Yeah.
But once you have a relationship with that person, I no longer, when I see my wife, I no longer just see a person. I see Susan.
Right.
I can't see her as a person. Although one of my favorite things is everyone. I don't mean I can't see.
There we
I
go.
can't understand that she is a person. I mean I don't perceive there's a person. I perceive there's Susan,
right,
who happens to be a person among many other things that are true about
just
her.
A very specific person.
Right.
Susan.
We perceive things as the most specific version of that thing. When you see your dog, you don't just see dog, and I interact with it in the way I interact with dogs generally. It's your dog, right? Although what you will, at least what I notice from time to time, and if you pay close enough attention, I think anyone will catch this from time to time. Every once in a while, there will be something where Susan and I are separated by some distance and we're in a public place and she's in a place that I'm not expecting her to be or whatever. So for just a split second, when I very first perceive her, I don't perceive her as Susan, but just as person. And I love those moments because every time it happens, I'm like, ooh, that woman's attractive. Oh, that's Susan. Like it's that second moment. It's like, oh, that's nice.
That is nice.
Yeah.
I'm going to be looking for those now.
Yeah, they happen. But it has to be like you don't have any logical expectation of it being that person.
Right.
It has to be that it could be any person and that most likely it is some random person you don't know. And if you can catch it the briefest split second to identify.
I'm thinking about moments in which maybe loved ones are surprised at the airport or something and you're looking at a person and it's that split second where you're
Right.
looking at that person and you realize there's a person and you realize they have a sign that says welcome home or whatever it is, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh crap, that's my mom or that's my kid. Right. Or
where
that.
If you're expecting it, if you know they're picking you up, then you're reading the signs
and
so you see it right
for
away.
That person.
But if you're not expecting it, it's kind of anytime you would do a double take, right?
Yeah.
Like anytime you would be like, oh,
yeah,
that first moment of didn't register right away.
Those are fun moments.
They
now
are
that I can identify a particular.
As long as the reaction is a good one. If in that moment you're like, oh, that person looks off. Oh no, that's my wife. That's not so great. Fortunately, I think my wife is a very attractive woman. Not that that's necessary for a good marriage per se. I don't know. People do their thing, but it's true of my relationship.
True of yours.
And I like that it's true. Because as soon as I find her unattractive, we're done.
You hear that, Susan? I hope she's watching this.
Sometimes she does watch.
I really hope she's watching today.
Sometimes she watches with one or more of my children too. So that would be a terrible joke.
That would be
for
a
them
very
to hear.
terrible joke. You might need to go home and satiate some more.
Wait, that's not the right word, but I got stuck on that. Anyway, satiate, placate. Satiate means to fulfill a desire.
Yep.
I'm not trying to be pedantic. I just
no. I appreciate it.
But
is placate doesn't feel like the right
no,
word.
it doesn't either. But I'm trying to think. There is a
Quell?
word. Yeah. Quell is usually learned for concern.
Well, worries. We were trying to quell their worries that.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. I feel like there's something closer to satiate though. That is why you went to satiate.
Yeah.
Like something linguistic in the spelling or pronunciation that's closer.
Not satiate. It'll come to me.
Whatever.
It'll come to me. That one will.
The other day, my oldest son, so big on language.
Yep.
My kids know all words. Like I don't keep words from them, or including curse words. And just like any person, because we all know curse words, or we wouldn't be able to be offended by them. Even if you find them very offensive and you don't use them, you know what they are, or you wouldn't be able to identify them.
Yeah.
So just like any grown person knows what they all are, my kids know what they all are. And just like any grown person, there's a process that guides language selection, right? Sometimes it's deliberate and conscious, but mostly it's not. Mostly it's automatic without our conscious thought. So they know the words. And my oldest in particular, who's 8, knows all the words, but he doesn't generally use them because he doesn't like to bother people or offend people, and it's just safer not to use them. But every once in a while will. And a couple days ago, I was telling Susan that I had a dream that in the dream, what was happening was that I had a dream where I had cheated on her. I didn't have a dream about cheating on her. I had a dream where the version of me in the dream had a dream about cheating on her.
Really trying to put some distance there. Huh?
And her in the dream, kicked me out of the house because of it, which is unrealistic and whatever, but that was the dream. And my son heard me saying that. And he goes, F that dream, except he said it for me.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a good use of F that dream.
Well, because he didn't know what kicked me out meant. I explained that. And he's like, oh, yeah, F that dream.
I love that.
Yeah. He still thinks when I first got COVID and it was only me and I quarantined from the rest of the family, this was back in 2022, early 2022, for 2 days before they started to get it and then we gave up. He'll still be like, that was the dumbest idea you ever had, being separated for 2 days. I'm like, you're right. It made sense, but it didn't work. So.
Made sense, but it didn't work. So, whereas the first time we had COVID in our home, it was pretty early in the COVID years. Or the COVID years. It was years, wasn't it? That sounds weird.
Yeah, it's still. I'll refer to the beginning of the pandemic. I don't ever say since the pandemic, or I'll say since it began, because as far as I'm concerned, it's still COVID. There's still COVID.
Yeah.
It's not. It didn't end, even though our attitudes broadly have shifted.
Yeah. But when it first happened for us, it was summer 2020, I think, and we quarantined for a full 2 weeks because both my husband and I had it. So we parented from the bedroom for 2 weeks, and they didn't get it, so it did work. So it wasn't a dumb idea.
Yeah. Yeah, not an option.
That was awful.
At the time, our youngest was 6 months,
right.
So we did not have that option. But when Susan got it too, having to wake up in the middle of the night because you don't have. What are we gonna do? Have somebody else come in and take over stuff?
Here, come get COVID, but also care for our newborn.
Right.
Our infant.
So we're waking up in the middle of the night, and you got to do the things you got to do to parent. You just don't have the choice. It was rough.
It is rough.
Anyway, tangents on tangents.
So it is a regular conversation between the two of us.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Tangents on tangents.
I just go wherever the wind takes me. That's why I explained at the beginning, it's an open conversation. Oh, I didn't say it in detail this time, but I'll usually say things just like any conversation, when people are paying attention to each other, the things that I say will impact what you're thinking and feeling and doing and what you say next.
Mm-hmm.
The things that you say impact what I'm thinking and feeling and doing, to point out that that's what we're doing here.
Yep.
I think about whatever you or the commenters put in front of me and we go there. I usually say we come up with a topic, but we don't have to stay on that topic. We'll go wherever.
We did not come up with a topic.
Well, that's how it usually is.
Yeah.
There was a brief period. I've been doing this for almost 4 years now.
Mm-hmm.
More than 4 years now? I should be interested to see when I started this. But there was a point at which we would come up with a topic in advance. But it's been a long time since then. I don't have it in me to come up with a topic in advance.
And especially when sometimes I want to talk about something new 10 minutes into that topic because someone said something that was really exciting.
Right.
Makes sense.
That's the thing is, we were talking earlier about people's perceptions and understandings of other people. Among all the things where we think that human understanding is true, and I try to use the term accurate, because accuracy is not a binary.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that you are accurate or inaccurate. You can be more accurate or less accurate.
Makes sense.
Where truth is a binary. Something is true or it is false. If you remember in elementary school when you were first taught to take true or false tests, they taught you that if any part of the statement is false, it is a false
It is a
statement.
false statement.
Because it is one or the other, true or false. So accurate, nothing that we conceptualize contains all of the information about that thing. But it can be that the information that we are considering is accurate, is relevant or true of that thing, even though it's not a complete understanding. So true is, I don't think it's the most useful term. It locks people into this thing about like, we know the truth. You don't. You have accurate and useful understandings.
Well, and it's akin to all or nothing, that all or nothing, black and white thinking too, like true, false is, yeah. I like all things on the spectrum.
Well, everything is. I haven't done it in a while, but there was a period where I was like asking different people in different fields, like anything I could think of where it's like, maybe this is an actual binary thing that exists in reality. I'd ask someone and they'd be like, no, actually, there are exceptions and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so as far as I know, there is literally nothing, like binary is purely conceptual, meaning that day and night, that's binary, it's mutually exclusive. But in the actual observation of the thing that happens, you can't say that there's only day and night. Like when exactly does day become night and vice versa?
Mm-hmm.
Same with life and death and all these. So true or false is binary because it's a concept.
Yeah.
But there's nothing in the actual, even at one point I thought literally maybe the binary code where it's a 0 or a 1 would be binary, but apparently no, there are exceptions even to that.
What?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
I don't know. I asked a computer programmer about it and they said, no, even then it's.
What is it, like a 0.5? I need to know what is there besides a 0 and 1?
I think it's more about like technical granular details, I'm guessing, about like how the program is interpreting things and whatever.
Okay.
You know, in the same way that like we can say life or death theoretically, like as a concept is binary, but the thing that shows that it's not really binary in real life is that how we define death, how we identify death has shifted over the years.
Yeah.
It used to be that death was when the heart stopped. Now we consider it to be when the brain stops. But even then it's like debated. You know?
Yeah.
And that's the thing, that these things can be endlessly debated because our concepts are just concepts that we utilize to navigate the world.
Mm-hmm.
They are not true and like 100% accurate. The map is not the territory. We have maps of the territory. The maps do not contain all the information that the territory contains. That would be a useless map. But you can't carry the territory around in your head. You can only carry maps. So it's still useful to make sure that we're trying to make our maps as accurate as representations as possible, but know that we're not trying to actually make it so that what we think of and perceive is the same as what is real.
Yeah.
Because it's not. It's not even possible. So one of the big ones that causes problems then is people having this idea of what not only other people do, but that most other people do it,
mm-hmm.
and that it is automatic for those people.
Mm-hmm.
So anything where people are struggling with like, I don't know why I can't do this thing, everybody else does it just fine. They literally are thinking that pretty much everybody else does the thing, and that in doing the thing, like they don't even have to put effort into it or think about it. It just happens automatically and easily. And in a lot of cases, the thing they're thinking about is not only, that's not the case, it's literally impossible and no one can do it. But they think everybody else does it automatically, and they're the only one that fails at it.
And that is when it becomes therapy hour.
Right. Well, that's one of the issues with depression, anxiety, all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
Once you get rid of the possibility, once you set a rule for yourself that you cannot answer any question of why is this person experiencing depression as saying because they are depressed, then you have to start coming up with different ideas and their theories and whatever. But that's the stuff that I say that people find to be useful is just from my explorations of like, well, there has to be some mechanism. And until I come up with an idea of what the mechanism is, I'm going to keep thinking about it. And once I come up with an idea about what it might be, I still know that might be wrong, but I kind of am done thinking about it until like I'll share it with other people. And if someone's like, well, that doesn't track, then I'll go back to it. Because like I'm not saying this is what it is. I'm just saying this is the best idea I've come up with. And so far I haven't had evidence that tells me that it's definitely not correct. So I'm just going to keep working with it until I discover evidence that says it's definitely not correct.
See, and that leads me down a whole different path for a whole different conversation of maybe that's why sometimes people don't share their ideas. It's because they don't want to then be incorrect and have to go back. That's too much work.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of what people do is
By
to
people, I
protect
mean
us. Well, so one thing, because we got to go wrapping up
Mhm.
a session, but one thought that I wanted to share that I think is important in a lot of this stuff, but especially depression, anxiety, laziness, all of these different things.
Yeah.
Is that one misconception we have is that cognition is free, that it costs nothing. So if somebody's saying, why is a depressed person sleeping all day? Why are they tired when they're not doing anything? What they mean by, including the person themselves, right? Like they'll say,
Yep.
I'm depressed, I'm tired all the time, and I'm not even doing anything. I just sleep all day and yet I'm still tired all the time.
Yep.
One part of an explanation for that for people can be, no, you're thinking, and thinking is an activity that takes resources, literally. This is not up for debate, right? Like
Yeah.
the systems which enable cognition, the nervous system, right? It literally takes resources. You burn calories, you utilize glucose. It damages the system, just like when you're lifting weights and your muscles get little tears, like utilizing the nervous system damages the system, puts wear and tear on the system, which equates to feeling tired. So people will sit there thinking, I'm tired all the time and I'm not doing anything. And their response to that is to say, well, I got to figure this out by thinking about it because I'm too tired to do anything. So all I can do is think, as though that's not doing anything.
And then they think and think and think.
And they think and think and think, and they're exhausted. And then they're like, why am I exhausted all the time? And they try and think some more. So it's not the only explanation, but it's a major variable for a lot of people.
That people forget about.
And I think it's useful to tell people that as far as like the way that the human system, our physical bodies, which include the brain and the nervous system, what they're built for, like no one will be confused. We all know that human bodies are capable of sprinting,
Yep.
right? We can do that. No one would be confused if I was like, well, all I do is I sprint, it's spread out over the day, but I sprint for like 3 hours a day. And other than that, I don't do anything. And yet I'm tired and I don't know why. People would be like, well, you're sprinting a lot. What we mean by that is what our bodies are designed for. Yes, it's capable of doing that. It's not meant to do that to that extent or that much.
Right.
And different ones are different and you get conditioned in different ways and blah, blah, blah. But thinking, cognition, to the best of our ability to determine, all the evidence we have suggests that our bodies are designed at maximum to engage in like serious cognition for a couple hours a day.
It's not like 3. Didn't you tell me 3? It's 3 to
2 and a
6.
half. We're relying on a lot of different
Okay.
like observed metrics to kind of put this number together. You could maybe make the argument of up to 4, but if you think about like early humans, and I don't mean like what most people will think of when they're like ancient Egypt or whatever, that was 20,000 years ago at most. Our species is 200,000 years old. Like they spent all day trying to like find food and shelter and whatever. There was not a lot of thinking being done. We're designed to do it a little bit. If you are thinking, and again, everyone's different, right? There are some people that can sprint more than others and you can condition yourself and it changes for an individual and other things matter, diet and all kinds of whatever. But if you find yourself engaged in cognitive activity, especially cognitive activity that you are aware of, meaning like if I'm playing a video game, for example, that's something that's involving a lot of cognition, but I'm not like aware of my own thinking. But especially anything where you're thinking and you're thinking, I'm like actively thinking. If you're doing that for more than an hour or 2 a day, like if you thought of that as the equivalent of you just ran 30 miles,
right,
then you wouldn't be so confused about why you're
so
tired. And you wouldn't be like, oh, the solution to my tiredness right now is to continue to do that activity that just tired me out. Because what can we definitively say is true of anybody who identifies as being depressed? Anyone, because to be diagnostically considered depressed, you have to have a self-report of, I am experiencing depression. If someone's sleeping all day, but they're like, no, I'm happy, then they're not depressed, right?
Right.
So what must be true of someone who is experiencing depression or who is labeled as being depressed is that they think of it as being depressed, which means they are thinking about their own subjective internal experience at least enough to monitor it and identify it as being depressed.
Yep.
So I don't care how depressed you are, I can definitively say you are thinking a decent amount.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, oftentimes people who are like the most depressed, they will have experiences that people would generally say like randomly here and there, but there are reasons. They'll have experiences where they just don't think, they don't check in for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And during that period, they are not experiencing depression. They don't feel depressed. But then afterwards, they'll say things like, oh, I was just distracting myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, I was still depressed at that time, even though I wasn't feeling sad
Mm-hmm.
in some way, as though depression means something other than or unrelated to how you feel.
Yeah.
Like that's not a real solution, just a distraction. But if the problem is that you're feeling a certain way and doing something makes you feel differently,
Mm-hmm.
how is that not a solution? It's not permanent, sure.
But it's still a solution.
Right. And
Temporary.
find me
Or
any permanent solution to feel. Find me anyone who has figured out a way to never feel sad in their life. There's no permanent solution. You just got to deal with it as it comes.
Yeah.
But this idea of it being a distinct like condition or entity or experience that you either, it's binary, you either have or don't have.
Right.
And if you do have it, you'll always have it in some way, shape, or form. Kind of like the same rhetoric we use for alcoholics who are in recovery, no
Right.
matter how long they've been sober.
They're still an
That
alcoholic.
someone who's a depressed person who has been generally happy, happy to what we would consider to be normal levels for 20 years
We'll still say, I have depression.
is still a depressed person.
Yeah.
Right. So the language gets really tricky here.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of times the danger is that people hear what I'm saying and think of it as, oh, so you're saying this isn't real and it's all in my head, which is not
No,
what
no.
I'm saying.
No.
I'm saying that while biology is a factor, to the best of our ability to determine biology does play some role, it is far from the only factor.
Yeah.
And it's worth looking at other stuff too. It's not a zero-sum game of either it's this or it's that. That's worth exploring. This is worth exploring. We don't just settle on one thing. So anyway, be aware that thinking costs you something.
Yep.
Literally, thinking tires you out. Feeling emotions costs you something and tires you out. Feeling sad is a very draining experience for anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling anxious is a very draining experience for anyone.
I have one final comment.
Seems as if we feel forced to stick to the label we gave ourselves in fear of being seen as disingenuous. Absolutely.
I know that person.
Do you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I absolutely 100% agree. A lot of the issue here is that people will experience something that they don't have a label for,
Mhm.
and it causes all kinds of distress. What is going on with me? What's wrong with
Yep.
me? I'll maybe even identify the problem as being something else, like I'm just a bad person or
Oh,
I'm
for sure.
cursed or whatever. And then we get a label. Oh, that makes so much sense, especially if we can then take that label and say, well, what do people who have this label applied to them do to get some help? And I do some of that stuff and it helps me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great, that label applies.
Mm-hmm.
But then, yes, oftentimes there is, like you're saying, there is sometimes this fear of then if you ever at any point say, and maybe there are things that could be done. Maybe it's possible that I could shift in such a way that this label no longer applies to me. Then it brings up this fear of, well, does that mean I've been faking this whole time? I'm not really this kind of a person.
I see. I know you have to go. I know we have to go, but I see this so much in so many of my like late diagnosed ADHD clients of like the label, and from speaking for myself, right? The label was such a reassuring and like affirming, validating thing in my life of being like, oh wait, I've gone 36 years struggling. Holy crap, there's a reason.
Right.
And there's medications that help.
Which is all great.
Oh my God.
And then as soon as someone suggests that there are things you could do so you wouldn't struggle this way anymore, then it's like, well, so then I could have not been struggling this whole time? No, definitely not.
Right.
Like I tried all that.
And no, or it's what we were talking about earlier. Well, I have ADHD, so this is always going to be a thing. I do this
Right.
because I'm ADHD.
I have, no joke, heard more than one person say, my ADHD makes me bad at sex. So I'm saying that people will take a label
If anyone
they
would
get.
like to explore that in therapy, those are my
Sure.
specialties,
Uh,
sex and ADHD.
People will take a label that they're given and find ways to make it apply to everything they have an issue with.
For sure.
Which it can. I'm not saying it is.
I could talk for another hour about how the impacts of ADHD on someone's sex life. I truly
Sure.
could. And
A related thought is people have sometimes pointed out that the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder is not a set of experiences and behaviors intrinsic to being an autistic person. They're the things that happen when an autistic person is in distress.
Mhm.
And so if you are autistic and you experience a certain level of distress, then yes, you have a meltdown, for example, which is one of the diagnostic criteria. If we are able to structure your life, you and the people around you or whatever, are able to structure your life in such a way where you are not in enough distress to experience meltdowns,
Mhm.
then you don't qualify for the diagnostic criteria and are no longer. So what that means is if theoretically we have autistic people who just live nice lives and are not in that kind of distress to the extent that they get diagnosed in the first place,
Mhm.
which then leads into this whole like, well, you're saying you're autistic, but you don't experience this thing or this thing. But that's the goal, right? Like the goal is to make it so that an autistic person
doesn't
doesn't
experience all of the
those
distressing things.
But it still is understandable why people take that as a badge of honor. As with any form of suffering, we don't want anyone to have to suffer. But if you do suffer, then of course you're going to want to say, well, here's the thing I got out of it. I
Yeah.
earned this thing. I learned this thing. I grew stronger in this way.
That goes by that resilience thing again.
And that's all true stuff.
Yeah.
But then people get it confused and think the only way to get stronger is to go through the suffering, as opposed to, no, that happens to be the silver lining of something that we wish didn't have to happen. And we don't want it to happen to anybody else. So this gets into the whole like trying to cure autism and whether people want there to be autistic people.
Right.
Because a lot of research has this underlying premise of it would be better if there weren't autistic people, which is absolutely untrue, I believe, as someone who identifies as autistic, obviously. But I would agree with the statement that it would be better if no one met the DSM diagnostic criteria for autism,
Agreed.
because that would just mean that nobody is experiencing the level of distress necessary to have meltdowns. I want to
Yep.
say the diagnostic criteria is 3 times per week.
I do not recall.
I can't remember for sure, but I think it is 3 times per week. And like, no, I don't want anyone to be having that experience.
I don't
3
want
times
anyone
per
to
week.
have that experience 3 times a month, let alone 3 times a week.
I mean, ideally, no one would ever have that
Ever.
experience ever. But so that's where I get like, I don't want anyone to meet that criteria. That doesn't mean I want to eliminate that kind of person from the world.
Yeah.
And people get confused, especially when they think, well, people are that way because they're autistic, and then they think the only way to make it so that no one's ever experiencing that level of distress is to make it so that there's no one that's autistic. But then we're using autistic to mean a different thing because by definition that doesn't, we're using it to mean something that isn't the DSM
Right.
criteria and something. And I gotta go. Another time. This is fun.
This was fun.
Yeah,
I want to come back.
please do.
I will.
Okay, we'll set it up.
Okay.
Good to be with you all. Thank you for those of you who are here and for those of you who are commenting. And I'll be remote next week, but I will be here next week. And I don't know, maybe you will, or
I
maybe
will,
somebody
but
else
maybe not
will.
here.
I don't know. We'll figure it out. But someone will be here next week. I'll be here and someone
And
else
someone else.
probably. All right, good to be with you. Goodbye.